Today we are going to be making decorated sugar cookies, which is one of my favorite things to make when I just want to lose myself in baking. Piping icing or dipping cookies is one of the activities where I find flow, which is a mental state when you're completely dialed into whatever it is that you're doing. Now, you might have seen decorated sugar cookies and thought that they were pretty elaborate and not something that you were able to make. But today we are going to make them, because even though sometimes these cookies can turn into gorgeous works of art, they are something that can be just quite accessible to start. We're going to decorate some sugar cookies while also trying to maintain the awareness of the messaging that we've received or the beliefs that we have about ourselves and doing new and hard things. When we're making our cookies, we are going to try to practice self-compassion. So if things don't turn out quite the way we want, we are not going to beat ourselves up. We are going to be patient and gentle with ourselves and just enjoy the process, not worrying about the outcome. Some of us in our life might have developed some pretty high standards for ourselves. You may or may not identify with the term perfectionist, which means we will not accept anything but a perfect outcome when it comes to performing in a task. Whether you identify with this term or not, having high standards might have developed for a variety of reasons. It might have been due to messaging that you received when you were younger, such as only receiving praise or affection, or receiving more praise or affection when you had a better outcome, such as getting good grades in school or scoring a goal in hockey. Or maybe it was the opposite. You might have developed high standards to try to cope in a world that felt really chaotic because it was the only thing that you could control. You might have quietly absorbed messaging from a caregiver who only accepted perfection from themselves. Or maybe it's just an inherited trait and you're not really sure where it came from. No matter where it comes from, holding ourselves to really high standards or only accepting perfection can cause us a lot of difficulty. Sometimes it creates anxiety, low mood, or stress because we will only accept a perfect outcome. If you strive for only the best, you might be less flexible, you might have trouble accepting other outcomes, and engage in what we call self-limiting behavior. So procrastination would be an example of self-limiting behavior, and you might procrastinate doing or trying something because the idea of only having perfection in that task feels really daunting. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I say recovering because it's something that I've actively been working on and still struggle with at times. But I'm trying, and today we are all going to try together. Even if you don't identify with being a perfectionist, you might still find that you struggle to try something new because you think that to do a hobby or activity, you have to do it well. So even if you don't think you have high standards or you're not a perfectionist, we just still want to go into this activity with the same approach, which is to just have fun and enjoy ourselves and really be in the moment without worrying what things are going to look like at the end. Part of having self-compassion is just examining our perfectionism or our high standards. So again, that can be acknowledging where some of these behaviors might have come from. We can also take a look at what having high standards or being a perfectionist has given to us, because we wouldn't have been chasing those high standards if it didn't give us something at some point. So maybe it helped you to get into a graduate program, or maybe it landed you your dream career. However, we also want to note what it costs us. So it might have been the things I mentioned before, like high stress or anxiety, but maybe it impacts your relationships with other people or your image of yourself and your self-worth. Part of self-compassion will be to just accept ourselves where we are at without expecting that perfection. we want to try to turn our attention to other sources of pleasure or worth. So this might be where a hobby such as baking or crafting or art or decorating comes in, because we can try to do something just for the joy of it. When I bake and something doesn't turn out the way I want it to, my new practice is to just actively talk myself through my experiencing of the stress or anxiety that I feel when my high standards or sort of perfectionist tendencies are activated. So if a bake turned out really ugly, but it tastes good, I try to focus on the fact that it's still edible and people can enjoy it no matter what it looks like. If it's the opposite and it looks good, but it tastes terrible, I try to focus on the fact that I made something that looks nice. I think the thing I'm still really currently struggling with, that I actively try to talk myself through, is having a sense that I wasted ingredients. So if something wasn't edible and it has to get thrown out, that's something I still experience a bit of discomfort around. And my reframe for that is trying to just focus on the fact that I had an experience, I tried something new, and I can try it again, and that it might be more successful next time. So no matter what happens today in our bake, I want you to just try to focus on enjoying yourself and not worrying about what the outcome is going to be. I'm going to do the same even while I am working through this with you, because I will acknowledge now that I am nowhere close to an expert cookie decorator. It's something that I do for fun. I've learned things through watching videos or taking courses, but as you might be aware, there are tons of experts in the cookie decorating industry that you could go and learn from if you wanted to learn technique and perfection and art. But here today, we're just learning the process, doing a few basics. And so while I decorate today, if I make mistakes, if something drips or doesn't end up the way that I wanted it to, even here while I'm on camera with you, hoping to offer you the best video I can, I'm still just going to work through the process and have self-compassion. So let's get started. So as you would have noted when you bought the course, we will have already had our cookies baked. So whether you baked these cookies on your own, or you used a store-bought dough or purchased plain sugar or shortbread cookies from the store, anything works. I have my cookies already baked, but we are gonna take a look at making the icing right now. So I'm going to cut the recipe in half only because I don't have as many cookies as I would need to use all of the icing. You're more than welcome to make the amount that seems to make sense for how many cookies you made, but I only made a half batch of cookies, so I'm just gonna make a half batch of icing. You can go about this two ways. You can also cut it in half, and if you wind up needing more, you can make more. Or Royal Icing freezes fairly well. I will probably still have a bit extra, and I just put it in my freezer for the next time I make cookies. So you can decide what you think makes the most sense for you, and make either a full batch or a half batch. So I'm gonna make a half batch. And the first thing that we're going to do is take our meringue powder and just mix it with the water, or if you're using lemon juice, that's totally fine. That's gonna give you some good flavor if you decide to do that. So the recipe calls for 6 tablespoons, so I'm just gonna do 3. And then a half a cup of water, so I'm just gonna do a 1/4 cup. Then we're just gonna give that a little stir to rehydrate the meringue powder a bit. I just do it with a fork. You can use a whisk or your mixing paddle, but I find a fork usually works well to get everything rehydrated. It'll foam a little bit. And then we are gonna add the rest of the ingredients except any food coloring. Unless of course you wanted to do something other than white, but we are gonna start with white and separate out some other colors later. Now we're adding icing sugar, and the recipe calls for 8 cups, so I'm going to do 4. And in doing my best to not make a giant mess, because icing sugar is very messy, I'm going to spoon and level this out. And probably still be a bit messy in the process, but that's okay. Now we're gonna add our flavoring of choice. Mine is a liquid candy peach flavoring, which I've never used before, but it sounded pretty yummy. So I've just done a teaspoon there because it calls for 2. And then we're gonna do a 1/2 tablespoon instead of 1 tablespoon of clear corn syrup. This just adds a bit of gloss and shine to the icing and makes it chewy rather than really stiff. If you've ever had a sugar cookie that had that icing that just cracks and hard bites, the corn syrup should help to make it a softer, chewy bite, which, as you might know from my other videos, we love a soft, chewy bite. Last thing is just gonna be a pinch of salt. So I'm literally just gonna crack my salt grinder in there. And then we are gonna turn this on to high for about 5 minutes or so until the icing's really smooth and glossy. So I'm just gonna run this and I will see you in a few. Okay, so this has been running for a bit. Everything looks nice and smooth, but as you can see, it's really thick, which is totally fine. We start out with a really thick icing and then we make it the consistency we want to for what we're decorating. So the consistency it's at right now you would use if you wanted to glue stuff together. So think of like a gingerbread house, that really thick white icing that you have. That's kind of what we've got going on right now. So if for some reason you were kind of gluing stuff together, you could use this consistency. You could also make it a tiny bit thinner, and people then use piping tips to make like fancy flowers and stuff. We are not gonna get that fancy today, but just so you know, there's lots of possibilities with the thicker icing. But we are going to make what we call flood consistency icing. So that is a consistency that's thin enough to fill the entire cookie, or flood it, as the lingo says. And then we'll probably make a few detail consistency colors. So it's a bit thicker so that it sits on top. So that's things that you could do, like eyes for animals, or script if you wanted to write something on a cookie. So we'll do a couple different options. Now, I realize that you and I are gonna have different cookie shapes, which is totally fine. I'm just gonna show you a few of the techniques that I know that I think are a bit more beginner or basic, and can be used in lots of different ways. And then you're gonna get to have lots of fun and honestly just experiment, because again, we are doing process. We're not looking for anything specific. So because we're not looking for anything specific, I didn't ask you to have any specific shapes or colors or sizes or anything like that, because I'm just gonna introduce a few ideas to you to then use as you will and let your creative imagination go. I have a little bowl here of water. Some people use spray bottles and things like that, so that they're not adding too much water at a time. I don't usually get that fancy, so it's totally up to you as to what feels most comfortable. But I'm just gonna separate out some of this icing, put it in a smaller bowl, And I am going to make some white icing that is that flood consistency. So the consistency that I want to be able to fill an entire cookie. So I'm just gonna take my little spoons here and I'm just gonna add a bit of water at a time. I'm gonna start with kind of a decent amount because I know that I want this icing to be a lot thinner than it actually is. And just give it a stir. So it's still quite thick. It definitely looks shinier and a bit smoother, but still very thick. We're not gonna be filling any cookies with this kind of icing. This would probably be good for piping because it stands up tall, but it's not that sort of concrete glue texture that it was to start. So I'm gonna get a little bit more water. And as you might know from my other videos with talking about physically baking things, we can always add more, but we can't take away. So try to just be cautious with how much water you're adding. Again, that might be where you might prefer something like a spray bottle because it would be nice and easy to go very gently with the water. And again, I'm just stirring to mix it all in and see what happens. So this would probably be a good detail consistency icing because I can pull it up and it basically stays in place. The lines that are in this stay in place. We'll do that in a bit more detail later. But again, I want it to be spreadable, dippable, flowing, so that it fills a whole cookie. And as I kind of noted earlier, there's tons and tons of content about cookie decorating. And because we're not really looking for any sort of specific process today, and we're mostly just talking about how to get started and to not let your high standards or perfectionism make you doubt that you can even do this. I didn't want to get too far into explanation and technique of the actual decorating itself, aside from just getting you going and getting you over that first hump. So if you're finding what I'm saying here isn't enough to make sense and you want to, there's plenty of free videos available or other resources about how to make your icing the thickness that you want. So I think this looks pretty good. When you stir it, it flows back. When you drizzle and kind of wiggle it, it all goes back together. So this should be a good consistency to fill or dip a cookie. Okay, so I'm gonna show you what it looks like to just marble dip a cookie. This is truly the easiest, most basic way that you can decorate cookies. It's really good for high volume, and I personally think it still looks really nice. So it's super easy, really basic, quick, and looks great. So we're gonna use gel food coloring. It can change the consistency a little bit of the icing, but it's a lot more pigmented and just works a lot better with this icing than those little droppers of like liquid food color. So I have my white consistency flood icing, and I've just marbled some pink food coloring through it. And then this cookie's a little bit janky because it was made with my leftover scraps of cookie dough. So this is a good one for dipping. And I'm just going to dip it right in the icing. Try to get all corners dipped. And then allow it to settle and drip as needed. You can give it a little bit of a wiggle and a shake to make sure everything settles properly, and then you can use your toothpick to just kind of make sure all of the edges are covered. I have lots of bubbles in my icing. So the other thing that you can do to make those go away is just give it a little tap on your table or your counter just to pop some of those bubbles. So you just kind of tap it a bit. You can also just kind of pop a couple of the bubbles in there if you need to. Now I'm going to show you how to make a detail consistency icing. And again, for lots more information on different consistencies of icing, feel free to do a lot more research before you really get down to business here. But I'm just going to show you what this will look like to make one that is not so thin. And when we are coloring our icing, we want to put our gel coloring in first, just because it's a bit watery, so it does change the consistency a bit. And I just realized, since I'm gonna need a lot of color for black, I'm just gonna squeeze it out. So I'm not sticking my scribe in there a bunch. So I've just added a drop. And then I'm gonna mix it. Which always feels a bit weird when the icing is so thick. But as you actually might be able to see, that thinned out a little bit with the amount of food coloring I did put in there. So if you're adding a lot of the coloring, I would do the coloring first before you add any water. Colors like red and black also tend to develop more if you let them sit. So this one really looks quite gray. But if you let it sit, it kind of develops or cures into a bit of a deeper color. So if you don't want to use up a ton of your coloring with the vibrant colors like black or red, you can let them sit for a bit. Another hot tip, I forget where I learned it, you can put black cocoa powder. So it's not your typical Dutch cocoa powder that you might use in brownies, but it literally looks black. You can add a little bit of that into your black icing and it makes it quite dark. The only thing I have noticed though is it does add a little bit of a chocolate flavor. So given that the flavoring I put in my icing today is peach, I don't want any chocolate flavor in there. So honestly, for today's purposes, I don't think I'm gonna worry about making this jet black. I think I'm gonna stop where it is and just leave it with kind of this darker gray, because this is just gonna be for smaller details. And again, as you can see, it's still kind of that like concrete texture, but it is smoother than it was before I put the coloring in. So again, I'm gonna take just one of my really small spoons and add just a little bit of water, especially because I'm doing a thicker consistency than I was last time. I don't wanna go too heavy-handed on the water. And what I'm gonna look for here is something that can go in a piping bag and be piped out, but not lose its shape after it's on the cookie. And this is one that I find I have a harder time trying to balance that consistency. So yeah, just gonna let you know that we will see how this goes. I still don't think that's gonna come through a piping bag super well. It's really thick, it stands straight. Again, this would maybe be good for like piping with a piping tip and holding its shape. So a little bit more water here. I've definitely had times where out of fear of it not being thick enough, I've made it too thick and then it doesn't come out of the piping bag in a fluid way. And if you're trying to write any letters or anything like that, it makes a giant mess. So it really can be a fine balance sometimes of finding the right thickness. Okay, I think this one should be okay. We will hope, at least. So then I'm just gonna show you how we're gonna put this in a piping bag. We use these tipless piping bags, so it's not the same piping bag you would use to decorate a cake. They're a lot thinner and more pliable, and you just cut the end off rather than putting a piping tip in it. And again, hot tip, you just put the bag in a glass and fold it over the outside, and then you just scrape your icing in, and it is slightly less messy than trying to just fill the bag in your hand. And I think some companies sell contraptions that stand the bag up for you, but if you're just casual like me, in terms of how much you do this, those aren't necessary. You just grab a cup from your cupboard, pull it out of the cup. Another hot tip, if you just kind of fold the bag by the top and swing it in a circle, it sends all the icing down to the bottom of the bag without having to do too much scraping. I'm probably going to scrape this a little bit here in a moment just to make sure that everything's all there. And then we're just going to tie it in a knot. You have to be a bit careful with these bags because they are a little thin to not rip them. But that at least takes the chunk out so that I can tie it in a knot. You also want to be careful not to overfill these bags too much because then you can't tie them properly. You could use like a chip clip or something if you needed to, if you overfilled it. But yeah, now that one is ready to go. It's fairly thick, but it feels soft enough that hopefully it should come out okay. So I am going to leave you here to experiment with your icing, and I'm going to finish mine. So again, if you want to take a pause and you want to go do some research and hear this explained in a different way than I did, maybe by the experts, please feel free to do so. Mix and match as many colors and consistencies as you want, as you feel you might enjoy in terms of the cookies that you have, the shapes that you have, the things that you might want to do. But again, for very, very basic purposes today, I'd love you to have just one flood at minimum and one detail at minimum, and at least at least two or more colors. Again, you don't need to go crazy if you're just playing around, but I think at least 2 colors so that you can do stuff with contrasting color, and at least one detail and one flood, so we can play around with texture a little bit. So I'm gonna go finish off my icing and I will come back when they're all ready. All right, so I've made all my icing colors. I have 2 detail colors and the rest are flood colors. And I picked the colors based on the shapes of cookies that I have. Plus I tend to use a lot of white flood icing, and best case scenario, if there's a bunch left over, I can just make other colors with it. So I left a large majority of it white. And we're just gonna start with a couple really basic things. So first I'm just going to flood one cookie. And then I'm going to show you a couple things from something that we call a wet on wet technique. So that's when you make designs or shapes using wet icing. So wet icing on wet icing, rather than waiting for something to dry and then adding stuff on top. So first things first, we're gonna cut open our piping bag. So what you wanna do is make sure the seam is out of the way. So running down the middle of the bag, because if you have it this way and you trim it like that, you might get a bit of a line in your icing. So I'm just gonna pinch the icing away from that tip, make sure the line is running down the middle of the bag, and I'm just gonna trim a small hole. Again, we can always trim more later if we want, so less is more. Start with something fairly small, and if you wanted to, you could cut more later. We especially want to be careful with the detailed piping bags. If you want small details, you want to start really tiny. Flood piping bags, you can usually have a little bit more, but yeah. So then what I'm going to do is just hold my bag in one hand, just kind of resting it like that with the tip outward. And then I'm just going to start by outlining the edge of my cookie. So I'm gonna go all the way around and then fill it in. You don't have to touch the piping bag to the cookie. It actually winds up having a straighter line if you kind of pull the bag while holding it over the cookie. You might see what I mean better in a moment, but the bag doesn't have to touch the cookie. I'm also gonna have my scribe handy so that when the cookie is filled, I can move icing around if I need to, maybe pop some bubbles if there are any. And again, we wanna try to strike a balance between not putting enough icing on this cookie or putting too much where it overflows on the side. So this is my dipped cookie from earlier, and as you can see, there was a bit too much that I didn't allow to settle before I put it down, and some icing dripped off the side. There's also a lot of bubbles in that one, so not the best, but you kind of get the effect of the marbling, but you can see how if there's too much icing, it can drip off the side. So we're just gonna start, and we're just going to squeeze and hold the bag above the cookie and just trace around the outside. I've actually already done something I didn't want to do there, and I made a bit of a squiggle, which wasn't ideal, but while it's still wet, you can kind of wipe off and move things around a bit. And now that I have my edge done, I can squeeze with a lot more pressure and just fill the space in. So just go around and around with more pressure, filling in all the space. The gaps aren't a really big deal because I can straighten everything out after, but we want to move somewhat quickly so that the icing doesn't set or dry before I've had a chance to kind of get it all in there. So on big cookies like this, you want to make sure everything's good. So I can actually also just like use the tip of my piping bag to wiggle things around a little bit and make sure all my spots are filled in. And again, I don't think I'm gonna add any more icing than is in there already because I think there's plenty on the cookie. And then I'm just gonna take my little tool and I can actually like pull the icing out to the edge to make sure it touches the edge completely and I don't have any bare cookie without it overflowing. So I'm just cleaning up my edges by kind of pulling everything outwards before it dries and just touching that up, making sure there's no gaps. This was a bit of a thicker flood icing, so I can already tell it's like solidifying a little bit. So I'm gonna work really quickly. I'm gonna do the same cut with my piping bag on, actually I'm gonna use green because I think it'll show up better. Same cut to my piping bag. And first I'm just gonna show you, I can make just little dots in my cookie and these will settle in to the icing so it becomes flat. And then what you can also do is make some dots, and then take your toothpick or your scribe. I'm gonna wipe whatever icing's on there off, and you can actually drag it through the dot from top to bottom, and it makes a little heart. So lots of opportunities for cute little designs. I'm just gonna add some more dots in here to make it look like sort of cohesive, that these upper corners are the dots, and then maybe a few more of these hearts through the middle. And when you're making the pull through the dot to make the heart, you want to make sure you're grabbing some of the white to go through the middle, because that's what makes the heart shape. Okay, so that's a wet on wet technique cookie. I'm not going to play with it anymore because I can already tell the icing's crusting over a little bit, and then you're going to start to see the lines if I kept dragging through to make more designs. And if I were to start playing around with the edges like I was initially, again, you'd be able to see cracks and things like that in the icing. So I think I'd rather just let it be, and I'm going to try to move it very carefully. So I'm going to take my edges, just slip my hands underneath, and move it carefully over to settle. These cookies take quite a long time to dry, even though you can see that the icing was setting quite quickly. We want to let these cookies sit for about 24 hours or so for them to completely dry, so that you don't screw up your design, because it might look dry on the top, but if you poked it, it would be all wet underneath. So, you know, if you're impatient, go ahead and eat a cookie, but if you want the design to really set, you're going to want to leave it for about 24 hours or so. Okay, because I was using a peach flavoring, I thought it'd be fun to make a little peach cookie, and I'm going to move on to this one a bit because I want to show you how we can make some dimension in cookies. I'll show you a couple other like wet on wet, or show you some detail on top of a dry design after. So I'm going to show you how we can make a bit of a shape and dimension on this cookie. So I'm going to start at the top here where the top of the peach would be, and I'm just going to make a line for the dip in the peach, and follow this around like I did before. I think I cut that hole a little bit bigger than maybe I would have wanted to, but I will just be careful, and I will use my scribe later to pull the color out. And as you can see with the bigger hole and the really thin flood icing, it's really easy to fill that up. So again, I'm just going to go in with my tool here, pull everything out to the edge to make sure it's covered, but by not going directly to the edge with this thinner icing that was flowing quite quickly, it's less of a risk that it's going to bleed over the edge. Okay, so I'm going to leave this to sit for a few moments, again, so that it has dimension, because I'm going to add the other edge of the peach after. And while it's still wet, but while it's setting a little bit, I actually want to add some sanding sugar to this one, because I thought it would be a fun touch to be kind of like a fuzzy peach, but it is a peach. And the other thing I thought I might try, which I've never done before, but we're gonna see how this goes, again, just to add a bit of the color dimension, is I'm just gonna put a bit of food coloring on my scribe and just kind of like run it through here, and make it just a bit of that like deeper color, kind of like a real peach would have. You could also, of course, do this with like just another color icing, but I thought I'd try this out and see how it goes by just sort of marbling the food coloring in there. Now I'm gonna put a bit of this standing sugar on top. I'm just going to grab some with my fingers and put it on top of the icing while it's still wet. Again, just to kind of get that like fuzzy peach sour candy effect, because I think that's really fun. And then I'm going to very gently tip it to get rid of whatever's not sticking, which made that edge fall a little bit, so I'll clean that up while I still can. So I'm gonna allow that to set so that it dries and my next layer doesn't bleed into it, so that it has dimension like a peach. And I'm just gonna start with the top of the ice cream cone. So keeping my bag above the cookie, just pull in a straight line as close as possible without going over, and then squeezing a lot harder to fill in the rest. I'm kind of swirling everything around there, making sure it's covered. And then going in with my tool to pull everything out to the edges. I think while I'm at it as well, I'm gonna do a bit of the cone, because I think what I'm gonna do is try to make kind of, you know, the swirly ice cream layer with another color here. And I'm gonna also want to put some detailed brown lines and make like a waffle cone. So I'm gonna do the base of the cone so that that one can dry as well before I add any detail. I'm gonna let those two dry. For this one, it's gonna be a watermelon, so I'm gonna wanna do the pink inside, the little white, and then the green. So I'm just gonna do the pink middle for now. And so I'm just going to pipe that out. So again, we can have some separation between all of the colors. And lots of nice texture. If you struggle with the idea of kind of piping things freehand like this, and you want to create lines for yourself, some people actually draw lines in the cookies with their tool, or if you of course don't have a tool, you could use like the tip of a knife to just draw yourself some guidelines. There's also edible markers available if you would like, so that you can just kind of create some guidelines for yourself. All right, now I'm gonna show you some more wet on wet. And then maybe I'll show you just some kind of like detail piping on this one as well when it's dry. So I'm gonna go in with my white again just to fill this cookie. Sometimes if you've left a color for a bit, you might have a bit of dried icing on the end. So just double check, because you don't want that to wind up on your cookie. I just pull it off. All right, so again, just going around the outside as close as possible without going over. And as we know, I can pull it to the corner later. And then going in with a bit more pressure and filling things in. Flooding is my favorite part. It's the part that I find the most relaxing. So if you're not in a rush and you're not doing a giant batch of cookies, it can be really nice to flood all your cookies. So this time I'm going to use the pink because I want to create a design as kind of the background, and then I'm going to pipe some black detail on top just to show you what some of that looks like. Hopefully you can still see the design. So this is just gonna be another wet on wet. And you can do some stripes. So again, just pulling on top. Just really light touch above the cookie. As you can see though, the color's already settling in. To go back to that part a little bit. And then we're gonna take this tool and we're gonna drag up and down because it makes like a striped feathered effect, which looks really nice on sort of plain shaped cookies. So we're just dragging that white through the stripes to make the feathering. Here. And again, I'm just gonna kind of set that one aside. I'm gonna fix that little hole first because it's a bit strange. Set that guy aside to dry a bit. So I'm just gonna make that other like dip of the peach. So by starting over here, just kind of creating that curve and following these lines. And filling in the rest. So I don't think I'm going to add any shading on this side, so I'll let it just dry for a moment, and then I'm going to add that sanding sugar again. I think the sanding sugar took away a little bit of the depth effect of doing the sides at different times. But you know what? That's okay. That was an experiment. I thought it would look really fun. I still think it looks pretty fun, but yeah, slightly less effective maybe than if I had just left it, which is fine. So again, I'm gonna let this dry a little bit so that I can do the stem and the leaves separately. So this was my marble cookie from before, my dip. It can be kind of fun to add some details on top. So I'm going to take my detail icing, and again, I'm gonna cut a super small hole because this one's thicker and I want it to be delicate. And I think I'm just gonna make like a little kind of hibiscus like flower detail. Like so. And as you can see, my black icing now does look black. It's not that great color it was when I first mixed it. As you can tell, I'm not always the most artistic if I'm just making things up by myself, but now it kind of looks like a little flower. Maybe it'll look better if I extend those upwards more. That looks worse, but you know what? It was an experiment. And just to show you that you can add stuff on top of the marble cookies if you want to make them look like they have a little bit more pop to them. They are obviously totally fine on their own, but you can just add a bit of detail. You might have an idea that looks a bit more effective than mine did. I'm also just gonna show you how that one's drying. So as you can tell now, it's like quite crusted over. If I touched it, it would still smush. So I'm definitely not gonna do that, but you can kind of move it around and see that it's fairly stable at this point. I took a moment to clean up my space a little bit, get rid of all the sugar, and let a couple things dry more because this one still sunk into the pink icing, which is not what I wanted. So I definitely just didn't leave it long enough. So I just wanted to give everything a few more minutes to settle. The other thing I could have done maybe to separate things out a little bit more is had like a thicker icing, but that's not ideal. So I just gave it a few moments, cleaned up all my sugar, and I'm gonna go in again and hope that things are a bit more dry. And I'm going to just put some waffle cone lines on this ice cream cone in a detailed consistency of the same color. I made both at the same time, so I pulled out the detailed consistency icing and bagged it before I thinned out the rest. So that means I have a identical color match. And again, I tried to make this hole quite small. And I'm just gonna have to tidy up those little nubs on the corner there. I'm gonna do my leaves first because I think I want my stem to be detailed and on top. So I'm just going to pipe out my leaves here. And this one over here. And as you can see, just to create a bit more shape, you don't always have to follow the exact line of the cookie. So I left a little bit there and a little bit here. That wasn't all the leaf, just so they don't just kind of look like blobs. So I'm just gonna do little bits. Great, so that's my watermelon cookie all done. And I'm just going to handwrite a little bit of script on here because my cookie shapes are kind of summer themed. I think I'm just gonna try to write the word summer. Again, the pros usually have lots of tools for this. They might, again, carve the word into the icing to make sure they're tracing the way they want. There's also some techniques where you can use an edible marker with like parchment paper to kind of create a stencil. And then there's also, of course, projectors that a lot of the pros use. So if your handwriting looks terrible, which mine probably will, and you see all the fancy perfect writing, just know that it's probably that someone had a projector. But yeah, I'm just gonna try and write out the word summer just for fun and to show you what this looks like. Not terrible. 2 M's in a row is actually just kind of ugly alongside of an S, but that's okay. And then I might just go in and add a couple extra details to make it stand out a little bit better. So yeah, just kind of shows you that you can combine like wet on wet with some detail on top. It stays kind of 3D and doesn't sink into the pattern below. Getting a nice little rainbow sherbet ice cream cone here. Gonna add a couple drips onto the cone so that it doesn't look so even and strange. There. So the last thing for me to do here is just add a little stem to my peach. And again, I'm not going to cover the entire thing, just to add a bit more shape to it. I think there's people who have feelings about like naked cookies, but I'm okay with a little bit of bare cookie. And I'm doing the detailed icing so that maybe it looks a little bit more woody. All right, so here is the full finished set. Not maybe my favorite work that I've ever done, but again, the point was just for us to talk about self-compassion and perfectionism, get started on this together, and just show you a few of the basic things that you can do while decorating sugar cookies. One thing I just want to show you is often if I have the time and the dough, I make 2 of each cookie, so that if one doesn't quite turn out the way I want it to, I have another to try out. So this was the first one that I did with you on camera, where I thought that maybe I added the second side of the peach too quickly, so I waited a little bit longer with this one. It helped a bit, but I do still think the sanding sugar was what kind of flattened everything out a little bit. So I think that's more of an issue with the sugar versus how long it sat, but I did just try to add a bit of extra dimension by changing the shape of the leaves and the peach itself, and personally I do like this one better. So if you have the time and the dough and the supplies, I recommend doing 2 of each, just because then if there's one you like better, then you kind of feel a little bit more confident in your efforts. There's a lot more space for trial and error. The other thing I want to show you is now I have all of this leftover icing. So this is how you can kind of store it to freeze. Just squeeze the icing out of the tip and flatten that tip out, and then you literally just fold the tip in and then use your finger and just push the tip inside the bag. So it becomes this little pouch with the tip in there. And then I do this to all of them and put them in a Ziploc bag and pop them in my freezer. I thaw them before I want to make cookies again, and you have to massage them because the moisture changes a little bit, and sometimes with the detail frosting you might have to remix and add a little bit more icing sugar and just put it in a new bag, but overall it tends to stay pretty well in the freezer like this. So that's how you can reuse the rest of your icing. And there you have it. We have now decorated some sugar cookies together. I hope you had fun and you were able to have compassion for yourself and not really have any expectations for how your cookies turned out. I'm not gonna lie, I had some hopes and expectations about how my cookies turned out, and they didn't all come to pass. So I think this will feel a little bit hard for me to put this out there, knowing that this is not something I'm an expert in, that there's videos that show this skill much better than what I did. But again, the thing that I'm telling myself is the whole point of us doing this together was just to get you started. It wasn't for us to be cookie experts together. It was just to try something new that I personally find really relaxing and really enjoy doing. I have a couple extra cookies left that I'm excited to just kind of get in the zone with and decorate tomorrow. So yeah, I hope you had fun, and if you enjoyed this, like I said, there's so much more for you to explore and learn, so maybe this is opening up a new thing for you. But yeah, I will see you soon.